Welcome to this next video in Introduction to Music Fundamentals B, where we're going to deal with cadences and how to write them. Just as a reminder from the last video, there are 4 different types of cadences. The perfect cadence is when you have chord 5 going to chord 1. The imperfect cadence, there are several of them. You can go chord 1 to chord 5, or chord 2 to chord 5, or chord 4 to chord 5. Basically, the imperfect cadence is when you land up on the chord 5. And then plagal cadence is when you go from chord 4 to chord 1. And interrupted cadence when you go from 5 to 6. So let's have a look at those briefly. But before we do that, let's look at some conventions of writing harmony. Some things that we look for avoiding and for good practice. So when we are learning about harmonizing particular pieces of music, and in this particular case, in your situation, we're just dealing with cadences. We're going to avoid using parallel fifths. And if you look at your screen now, I've given you 2 examples of parallel fifths. If you look at the bottom, you'll see that we're working in C major. There's a capital C. And we're working with chord 1 going to 5 in the first example. Okay, so that's an imperfect cadence. If you look at the bass and the tenor parts, you'll see that the first chord, it's C going to a G. That's C, D, E, F, G. That's a fifth. Okay, between the bass and the tenor is a fifth. In the second chord, also in the bass and the tenor, you've also got a fifth, G going to D. G, A, B, C, D. In harmonic writing, we try to avoid parallel fifths between the voices. Okay? It can be between any of the voices. It doesn't have to just be between the tenor or the bass. It can also be between the bass and the alto, or the tenor and the soprano. In the second example there, you'll see that the parallel fifths are between the soprano and the alto voices. So importantly, we're trying to avoid these parallel fifths. There are good reasons for this, which are too many to explain in a video like this. But for the moment, just trust me that we're going to be avoiding perfect fifths. Before you hand in an answer of a particular cadence, always check if you can see any parallel fifths. Also, we try to avoid parallel octaves. Now, this happens mostly between the bass and the tenor voices, but it can happen between any of the voices like before. If you look at the example here, you'll see we're in C major, chord 5 going to 1. In the bass and tenor voices, we've got a G in the bass, a G in the tenor, and they move to the next chord using C and C. Those are called parallel octaves. Both of them are moving to exactly the same notes. We're trying to avoid those things. Then, we're going to try to keep the movement in the alto and tenor parts stepwise or by small leaps. Okay, so let's have a look at this particular example. We've got chord 4 going to 1. That's a plagal cadence. If we look at the first chord, it's the chord starting on an F, F, A, C. If we look at the tenor part, it starts on a C, and the second chord, it just stays on the C. So there's hardly any movement. There's no movement at all. In the alto part, it starts on an F, and it only moves by step down to an E. We're always trying to keep the tenor and the alto parts either staying on the same note or only moving by a step up or down. That's good practice for the moment. Okay, so stepwise, or at the most by a third. You don't want them to be jumping big jumps. Then we're trying not to have big gaps between the soprano and the alto parts and the alto and the tenor parts. So let's have a look, for example, at this example on the screen. You'll see we're in C major, and we've got chord 4, 6 going to chord 5. That is an imperfect cadence. Now, if you look at the first chord, chord 4, 6, you'll see that the tenor voice is very low in the bass clef, and there's a big gap between it and the alto F. There's more than an octave gap there. We are always trying to avoid such big gaps between the tenor and the alto. Then look at the second chord. You'll see the same sort of thing happens there, where we've got a very big gap greater than an octave between the alto and the tenor, and also between the soprano and the alto. We try to avoid that. There mustn't be gaps bigger than an octave between the soprano and the alto, or between the alto and the tenor. But there can be big gaps between the tenor and the bass parts. So you can have greater than an octave between the tenor and the bass part, which means that you could have, for example, a middle C in the tenor part, and then an F or an E below the stave, below the bass clef in the bass part. That would be completely acceptable, but not between the alto and the tenor voices, and not between the soprano and the alto voices. Then, we always try to make the soprano and the bass parts move in the opposite direction, or in contrary motion. Let's have a look at the example that we have here. Also in C major, this is chord 5 going to chord 1. That's a perfect cadence. If we look at the bass part, it goes from G down to C. G going down to C. If you look at the soprano part, it's a B going to a C. It's going up to a C. So the bass part is going down, the soprano is going up. That's what we're aiming for. They're going in opposite directions. Try not to get them to go in the same direction. The voice parts should not all move in the same direction. Okay, all going upwards or all going downwards. If you look at this example, we've got C major, chord 1 going to chord 5. It's an imperfect cadence. If you look, the bass part is going up, the tenor part is going up, the alto part is going up, and the soprano part is going up. We try to avoid that at all costs. Remember in the last example, I showed you how the bass part went downwards and the soprano part went upwards. Okay, those are the kind of things we're looking for. There must be some variation of going up and down between the chords. Then, a very important note. The leading note of a scale must always rise. If we're in C major, the leading note is C, D, E, F, G, A, B. The 7th note is the leading note. B must always rise to C. Okay, the leading note always goes to the tonic note. So when you're working with chords, if you have the leading note in the chord, it must rise to C. And that must be for every key. So you'll see that I've put that there. The B is in the soprano voice in chord 5, and it rises to the C in chord 1. So those are some of the conventions that we follow when we are writing cadences. You'll notice that I have labeled all of the examples underneath. All right. Always keep those labels underneath unless you are using jazz notation, in which case they would be above. Also remember to put the key in. You'll remember that you will have seen that the key C major was at the beginning of all of those examples. Always remember to include the key. All right, so when we are writing cadences, there are 6 steps to follow just to make sure that we always get them right. So imagine you have this question. Notate a perfect cadence and an interrupted cadence in F major. The chords must all be in root position. So that's the question. Step 1, we're going to find the key signature for F major and write it at the beginning of the answer. Then we're going to write the full chord table for F major. Step 3, we're going to remind ourselves which chords are needed for a perfect and interrupted cadence. Then we're going to circle the chords that we need in the chord table. We're going to also check which notes need to be doubled. Then step 5, we're going to write the correct bass notes for the cadences and label the chords. And then step 6, we're going to fill in the other parts and making sure that we adhere to the conventions that I've just gone through. So here's step 1. We've written the key signature. If you go into your table of keys, you'll see that F major has a 1 flat, it's B flat. Okay, so I have put in the key signature. Step 1. Step 2, we're going to write out all the chords. You do this first by writing out the scale of F major, and then by putting the chords all in one by one above them and labeling them underneath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Always label them according to their major and minor qualities. Then we need to remind ourselves which chords are needed, and you just have to learn these by heart. Perfect cadence is chord 5 to 1. An imperfect cadence is always chord 1 or chord 2 or chord 4 going to chord 5. A plagal cadence is chord 4 going to 1, and an interrupted cadence is 5 going to 6. You just need to remember those by heart. Just know them. In this particular question, we're working with a perfect cadence and an interrupted cadence. The perfect cadence is 5 to 1, and the interrupted cadence is 5 to 6. So now we circle the chords that we need. We need chord 1, we need chord 5, and we need chord 6. Chord 1 and 5 are major chords, so we know that we'll have to double either the root or the fifth. And chord 6 is a minor chord, so we know in that chord we're going to have to double the third. All right, step 5, we have to write out the bass notes. So if we look at our chord table, for a perfect cadence we need chord 5 and 1. Chord 5, the bass note of chord 5 or the root note of chord 5 is a C, and the root note of chord 1 is an F. So we have to have a C going to an F. There, you'll see in the answer I've written C going down to an F. It could have gone up, of course, to an F. That's fine too. But in this case, I've chosen to go down to the F. Then for chord 5 and 6, we need to check. Chord 5, the bass note is a C. And chord 6, the bass note is a D. So we need to write C and D. All right, that's step 5. We've got the bass notes. You'll also see that for step 5, I've added the label of the chords underneath. I've written F for F major, capital F, because we're in a major key. I've written chord 5 and chord 1, chord 5 and chord 6. Right, and then step 6, we're going to fill in all of the other parts. So chord 5 in F major is C, E, G, and we can either double the C or the G because it's a major chord. You'll see that in this particular example, I've chosen to double the C. So I've got a C in the bass, a C in the tenor, then we still need an E. I put that in the alto voice, and a G, I've put it in the soprano voice. Then we've got to move to chord 1, which is F, A, C. I've got the F in the bass, and we can either have 2 Fs or we can have 2 Cs. You'll see that I've chosen to double the F. I've got it in the bass voice and in the alto voice. Then we still need an A. You see I've put the A in the soprano and I've put the C in the tenor voice. Now look at how I've followed the conventions. Do you see that the bass voice goes down, C going down to F. The soprano goes up, G going to A. Okay. Then you'll see that the tenor voice is a C and a C. It doesn't move at all. It just stays on the same note. And the alto only moves one step up, E going to F. If we do all of those things, you won't get parallel octaves and you won't get parallel fifths and you won't have any of the other issues that we looked at in those conventions. All right, now let's look at the second cadence, which was 5 going to 6. Chord 5 is C, E, G. All right, it's a major chord, so we can double either the C or the G. I've chosen to double the C. So we've got a C in the bass and a C in the tenor. We still need an E. I've put the E in the alto voice and the G in the soprano voice. Now we're going to chord 6. Chord 6 is D, F, and A. It's a minor chord, so we have to double the third, which is an F. We need to have 2 Fs. We've got a D in the bass, and you'll see that I've put the 2 Fs in the soprano and in the alto voice because they can just move directly by step to that F note. And I've put an A in the tenor. If we look at the movement of the parts, you'll see that The bass part moves up from C to D. It goes up by step. And the soprano comes down, G to F. So we're following that rule of the soprano and the alto. The soprano and the bass voices need to go in contrary motion, in the opposite direction. You'll see that the alto voice moves just by a step, and the tenor voice only moves by a third. So they're not moving a lot. They're just staying very close to where they are. So we followed the rules. We don't have any parallel octaves, and we don't have any parallel fifths. Do you see how easy it is actually to do this? If you just follow the steps step by step, you will be able to do this very, very easily. And that's where we end this particular video.